So, once upon a time, there was a marvelous and formidable woman called Hannah Arendt, who was a German Jewish woman and one of the leading political theorists, political philosophers the second half of the 20th century had known. And she authored a seminal book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, about Stalinism and Nazism. This book is really a trilogy put together. There's one part about imperialism, one part about totalitarianism, and one part about anti-Semitism. She was a Holocaust refugee. She was very close to her teacher, Martin Heidegger, who was a great genius who became a Nazi. And the other geniuses became Nazis too, like Carl Schmitt. He was a big deal philosopher who became a Nazi. And so, appropriately enough, the epigram which starts her text about anti-Semitism is very powerful and one to ponder. It states, normal people don't know that everything is possible. Normal people don't know that everything is possible. So, for example, when my grandfather was 17, most of the people around didn't think it's possible that most of European Jewry would be annihilated, and many of whom were annihilated by gas. He thought the Nazis, Nazi Germany, would work the Jews to death. So he ran for his life. He was actually deported with Heschel on October 27th, 38. That saved both their lives and thousands of others. Then he came to Israel, escaping murderous anti-Semitism. And, as his grandson, more than, 30 years ago or so, don't want to date myself too much, but when I was in high school, especially since I'm already married, we couldn't leave the school premises during recess in high school because buses were exploding all over Tel Aviv. Even though the Rabin government just made an agreement with the PLO for a two-state solution, which I personally very much supported and was active for. However, Hamas, which has the protocols of the Elders of Zion on its charter, a distinctly anti-Semitic, not anti-Zionist, forgery, it wasn't safe. So, so I encountered that in my adolescence. Many years later, I thought about it. I was in 8th grade. Makes me feel a little emotional. The first Gulf War, January 91, my parents, my siblings, and I were, in a sealed room wearing gas masks as Scuds were landing in greater Tel Aviv. We heard the explosions, the glasses were rattling. What I want to share with you is, many years later, I was reflecting what it must have been for my paternal grandfather to see his grandchildren wearing gas masks, knowing that his own mother and brother perished in Auschwitz. And then I lived in Europe for 7 years, and now we have anti-Semitism back in Europe, as Rabbi Sessler says, within living memory of the Holocaust. When I lived in Paris for a year and a half, most recently in 2006, the then chief rabbi of France, Rabbi Sessler, asked French Jewry not to wear a kippah in a public space. It's just too dangerous. In London, it's in many areas pretty similar. I lived in London also for 5 years. So I experienced, vehement anti-Semitism as an Israeli, and then living in Europe also as a European national. I came to America 20 years ago. I'm blessed to be now also an American, a Jewish American. And October 27th of last year, 2018, the attack in Pittsburgh, the way I put it is that October 27th, 2018 is the Jewish American 9/11. In what respect? In the respect that it shattered the illusion of invulnerability. Just like, before 9/11, there was never such a devastating attack on mainland America. Hawaii is an island, as we all know, So Pearl Harbor was different geographically speaking, and 9/11 shattered that illusion of invulnerability. The same thing could be said for Jewish Americans. And then we had Paui as well. So normal people don't think everything is possible. We were under the assumption after almost a quarter of the millennium here in America that this kind of murderous physical anti-Semitism is something that can happen over the Atlantic in Europe and Israel, but that we are immune to. But we are not immune to that which Robert Wistrich, the late Robert Wistrich, a Hebrew University scholar, calls in his magisterial work on anti-Semitism the longest hatred. Those of you who were with us 12 days ago at the Sephardic Temple, Rabbi Sachs touched briefly upon his theory of anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism is essentially a virus which attacks the body politic. And like every virus worth its name, it mutates in order to outsmart the immune system. So in antiquity we had religious anti-Semitism. The Greeks, ancient Greeks and Romans thought that we're simply lazy. We don't want to work a seventh of our waking time. And Philo wrote this kind of utilitarian apologetic that actually if you rest one day you're rejuvenated and then you can produce more. Of course that's not really Shabbat. Then came the great medieval powers of Christianity and Islam, and all too sordidly, we were rendered culpable of deicide in Christian Europe. So anti-Semitism was prevalent while resorting to the cardinal value of the time. What was the cardinal value of humanity in the West in medieval times? Religion, right? So anti-Semitism was under a religious guise. Then, by the way, in 1391, there started what we would later on called in the 19th century in Russia pogroms, only against Jews in Spain, right? Spain at the time was what North America is today. So, the main Jewish presence, cultural, financial, outside Israel. And in 1492, the expulsion came from Spain. 1497 from Portugal. Don Itzhak Abarbanel wrote about this. He was a Secretary of Treasury of Portugal, and then he was advisor to King and Queen Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. He was the Alan Greenspan of the Iberian Peninsula. I like to say Joseph, the biblical Joseph, was the first Alan Greenspan in Jewish history. Ben Bernanke, take your pick. But it's interesting that Prime Minister Netanyahu's father, the late historian Ben Zion Netanyahu, whom I was privileged to know, who lived to be 102, he wrote a seminal work on the origins of the Spanish Inquisition. And his main novelty or insight is that post-expulsion Spanish anti-Semitism was a precursor to Nazism and racist or racial anti-Semitism. Because the Jews who stayed in Spain, those who even became in good faith good Catholics, what surmised was what really happened, usually happens, which is, there's this Catholic historian, Paul Johnson, who wrote in his book, A History of the Jews, that Rabbinic Judaism is the world's most sophisticated machine for the production of intellectuals ever devised. So ours is a hyper-intellectual civilization, so Jews start excelling in the life of the mind, in commerce, in the professions, in academia, and such. That breeds resentment, and enmity, and animosity. So they were deemed as Catholics of impure blood. So that was the first kind of ethnic, racist anti-Semitism in the early 1500s, teaches us Professor Netanyahu. And then we saw, so this time, and then, in modern times, first pseudo-scientific anti-Semitism, supposedly Jews are racially inferior alongside other ethnic groups. And today, Rabbi Sachs and others argue that the main source of anti-Semitism comes under the guise of refuting the Jewish people's right to exist politically. As the late Amos Oz used to say, the founder of the Peace Now movement in Israel, not exactly a right-winger, an ardent leftist, Amos Oz likes to say that when his father grew up in Vilna, Lithuania, he saw a graffiti on the wall one day saying, Jews go to Palestine. And many decades later, when the state of Israel was a fait accompli, he went back and he saw another graffiti that says, "Jews, get out of Palestine."
Yeah.
And Amos Oz also says that, for some reason after World War II, nobody doubted whether Germany and Austria have the right to self-determination. Somehow the right of the Jewish people to politically exist in any boundaries is supposedly a legitimate cause for political discourse in the so-called respectable salons of Europe and even in college campuses around the United States. Now, an important qualifier is another thing that Rabbi Sachs says. He was asked at a school in Scotland, what's the difference between legitimate criticism of the state of Israel and anti-Semitism? Mm-hmm. So he told the kids, raise your hand if you think it's legitimate to criticize the British government. Everybody raised their hands. Now tell me if you think it's legitimate to claim that Great Britain has not the right to exist. Nobody raised their hands. So now you know the difference between anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of Israel. Two modes of anti-Semitism. Joseph's dreams. Let's do a little bit of hardcore Torah. According to Rabbi Soloveitchik, the two dreams of Moses denotes the two.
Joseph.
You said
Joseph.
Moses.
What did I say?
You said
Moses.
Oh, I'm sorry. According to Rabbi, I'm rushing because there's so much to cover. So Rabbi Soloveitchik teaches the two dreams of Joseph denote the two prevalent modes of anti-Semitism. The first dream about binding sheaves is a dream about material economic prosperity. For that, those around him hate him. So he says, there's no need to be ashamed or deny the fact that Jews tend to excel in the life of the mind, because ours is a hyper-intellectual civilization. And that is one mode of anti-Semitism, is economically induced or because Jews excel. The other dream that Joseph, this is Rabbi Soloveitchik, not me obviously. The other dream is that cosmic dream about the sun and the moon and the stars being subservient, so to speak, to Joseph. And that's a cosmic dream about a spiritual vocation which goes beyond nature's elements, right? And that is the idea of a calling, of going beyond the world to encounter God and to live in sanctity, right? And notice that for this dream, Joseph is not hated so much. The Torah says "Vayekan'u bo." That provoked jealousy. That provoked jealousy. So according to Rabbi Soloveitchik, there are two prevalent modes of anti-Semitism. One is material and one is spiritual. Now, if you look at the two main rabbinic holidays in the Jewish calendar, Hanukkah and Purim, they also denote two modes of anti-Semitism. Hanukkah, Antiochus, is anti-Judaism. If you practice Judaism, we will execute you, right? That was the Hanukkah War of the 160s BCE. These were the Adrianic persecutions of the 130s CE. That was the Soviet Union, right? You can exist as long as you don't exist Jewishly. And then, of course, there's the murderous Haman Purim-like anti-Semitism, in which the very physical existence of the Jew in singular and the Jews in the plural is a non-starter, right? That's Haman, the Amalekites, National Socialism, and so forth. So we have two modes of anti-Semitism going on here. Now, there's so much going on. When Jacob, Israel, the patriarchs, shall they, can you,
wait.
please make we'll open it up very soon. I just don't want to lose my thread, I apologize. I would love to hear it though, I apologize for the postponement. So when Jacob is going to encounter Esau, Rashi says he installed himself for three things, for prayer, for war, and for gifts. And that for me denotes what should be the Jewish approach. So we encounter challenges, including existential, political, physical challenges like murderous anti-Semitism. Prayer denotes that we should soulfully and spiritually empower ourselves with Torah. War, many would argue, myself included, is the imperative of Zionism and having a place under the sun that's politically home. Again, I'm leaning on my teacher, our teacher, Rabbi Sessler, who reminds us that Israel is home in the Robert Frost sense of the term. Home is where, when you really need to go there, they have to let you in. So, prayer, spirituality, prepare for war, be able to defend ourselves. I can't help but think, but when the raid on Entebbe took place, there were Holocaust survivors there. There was a man called Yitzhak David, a Greek Jew, who had a number, and the two German terrorists, one of them would call out the Jewish names to be segregated to the other room, a selection of sorts. And somebody asked, what's the point of having a Jewish state of Israel if all of this can happen again? So the second thing is having, preparing for war. The third thing is Jacob prepares gifts. There's a nice Irish Catholic American called Thomas Cahill, who wrote a book called The Gifts of the Jews.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So we have to, we are commanded veheye bracha, to be a blessing to the world and to the environment in which we dwell. And lastly, Jacob also splits the camp into two. The rationale being, should the enemy wipe out one side of the camp, the other would persevere. If you look at Jewish history since the Babylonian exile 28 centuries ago, we've always had this dialectic of two main global centers. Right? Today it's North America and Israel. It used to be, Babylonia, but there are always two. Hegel, the French philosopher, used to say, German, that times of peace are empty pages in the history books. And one of my favorite American expressions is never waste a good crisis. and Rashi said 2 Shabbats ago about Shifra and Puah, the two midwives who perpetrated the first recorded act of civil disobedience in Jewish consciousness, that the birthing stool, I think again Rabbi Sachs mentioned it, that they used to help deliver children, to bring new life to the world. What was the name of that chair? Today there's like this beach bowl, I remember my wife was using, many women use today when they give birth. What is the name of that chair? Mashber, which is Hebrew for crisis. A crisis, if used well and harnessed wisely, will give opportunity for new life. Case in point, the big exile of the year 135 transformed Judaism from a territorial religion, temple-based, Jerusalem-based, into textual sovereignty, what George Steiner, the literary critic, calls the text as homeland. Heinrich Heine, the German poet, used to say the Torah is the portable home of the Jewish people. So that great catastrophe transformed us from a territorially based people to a textually based. 1096, the Crusades start. From there emerged Hasidut Ashkenaz, the German mystics of early medieval times. 1492 is the historical catalyst that ultimately gives rise to the Kabbalists of Tzfat and to the cosmic notion of Tikkun, that we wander around the world because everywhere we go, we recalibrate the cosmic equilibrium and we redeem divinity by virtue of performing mitzvot. So these are three examples where terrible things happen, but we harness it for the good. Anybody read a book called When Nietzsche Wept by Irvin Yalom, the Jewish-American psychiatrist? It's a fictional work. Nietzsche supposedly is undergoing therapy with Freud. I want to say, when the Rebbe wept. In 2 days' time, the 10th of Shvat, it's going to be 69 years since Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson agreed, after a year of refusing adamantly, to become the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he gave his first Hasidic discourse, Bati Legani, I arrived in my garden, 2 words from the Song of Songs. And something very interesting happens in this discourse, which we can listen to on YouTube. I don't understand Yiddish, so I read the English subtitles. But, the man is a Holocaust refugee. His brother was murdered by the Nazis. His grandmother, much of his family, is murdered by the Nazis. His father died in exile from Stalin. He doesn't flinch. There's only one part where he starts sobbing. Really sobbing. And it's when he says that there are millions of Jewish children out there, and I'll say it in his Eastern European accent, who don't even know Aleph Beis. That shatters him. That is the one thing that shatters him. So, the point I am trying to make is that if we focus on Jewish suffering, on what Rabbi Soloveitchik called a Jewish fate, our historical and political predicament, instead of focusing on Jewish destiny primarily, which is Jewish spirituality and the Jewish spiritual vocation, then we will continue to experience what we've been experiencing for the last half century. Some people like Chabad, some people are ambivalent or less about Chabad. It's a fact that Chabad is the most spiritually successful group in the Jewish world. And the reason for that is that they glow Judaism. And that's, I think, what we need to do, to shine Judaism, to emanate Judaism. The Jewish American historian of the Holocaust, Lucy Davidovich, observes that 1 out of 2 Jewish Americans who were brought up on an immoderate diet of Holocaust and Israel's struggle for survival are opting 1 in 2 out of Jewish life, or out of the Jewish story. And she says that actually makes perfect sense, because if what you're taught primarily and sometimes exclusively about Jewish life is what terrible things have been happening to the Jewish people in the last 7-8 decades, then maybe the best thing you can do for yourself and for your descendants is to stop being Jewish. So my point is that focusing primarily on the political and historical plights of Judaism and Jewish fate doesn't hold water, and really leads to our disintegration as a people. Again, I can't resist, forgive me before I conclude, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, we mentioned 2 weeks ago at the synagogue, his father had to quit school when he was 14, his mother 16. They said they gave him love of Judaism, and that nourished him. And he quoted the English poet Wordsworth, who says, "That which we love, others will love, our children, our grandchildren, and we will show them how." And that's really, I think, the most important thing that we could do. FDR had a Hasidic moment when he famously said that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Like Rabbi Nachman said, right? The most important thing is to have no fear at all. To terrorize means to scare, to petrify. The main goal of terrorism is to incapacitate mentally, emotionally, spiritually the millions. Terror can only take a handful of lives. Even 3,000 on 9/11 compared to 320 million Americans. Every soul is a world, a universe entirely. And by no way do we want to diminish that. But really the main goal of terrorism is to destroy us spiritually and internally. To conclude and to start the conversation, I just want to say this. Rabbi Sachs's predecessor, Chief Rabbi Lord Jacobovitz, once said in a book of dialogues, more than Judaism needs to be taught, it needs to be caught. It needs to be spiritually apprehended, not through the intellect, but by what Kabbalistic psychology calls da'at, lived mindfulness, embodied mindfulness. when the sixth Rebbe came here after having lost a daughter and survived Stalin and Hitler, there's a whole book and movie about it. He was found studying Torah in Warsaw, wearing a Hasidic garb, and said, we're going to take you and your family and take you to America, but you have to change and shave. We're going to take you through Berlin. You can't wear a Hasidic garb. He said, I'm going to go the way I am. And he insisted on taking 20 people with him. So today there are hundreds of people who are alive because of him, but he came to America in a wheelchair. And when he landed here, the first thing he said in Yiddish is, America is no different. Just like we can transform souls in the old world in Europe, we can also transform. So some people had defeatism. America is such a materially oriented utilitarian culture and civilization that it's a lost endeavor. But he said America is no different. But another great 20th century rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, actually reminds us that America is different. In what way is America different? Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said that America is a malchut shel chesed. It's a kingdom of loving kindness. There has never been a place more hospitable to the Jewish people than the United States of America. A few years ago at APAC, I heard somebody who used to work for the Obama administration. Unfortunately, I tried to find his name online and I couldn't. He was one of the undersecretaries, I don't remember for what, and he was sharing with the rabbis over lunch at APAC that his father-in-law, who's a survivor, was running in the forest for his life during the Holocaust, and then he saw a tank. And he thought the tank was going to shoot at him. So he said, Shema Yisrael. And then the guy popped out of the tank and said that he's from the American Army. So this survivor said the few words he knew in English. He said, God bless America. So we have both these things. We have Shema Yisrael and we have God bless America. And we're also the most, even if those of us who are not Jewish Americans, we are the most privileged generation in Jewish history, because we have both sovereignty in Israel and complete equality in the diaspora. And that's something no other generation ever had. So the last thing I'm going to say is that, Parshat Lech Lecha, the third Torah portion, starts with a commandment to immigrate geographically, secondarily, but internally and soulfully primarily. And we're so focused and caught up with Genesis 12:1 that we forget the equally, if not more important mitzvah of Genesis 12:2, the succeeding verse, the mitzvah that God gives Abraham, and really all of us, is Veheyeh baracha, be a blessing. Right? And the way I understand it, to be a blessing is a threefold endeavor. One is to actually become a bracha, to become a tefillah, to become steeped and united with God. That's the idea of dveikut, soulful unity with God. The second is to be a blessing to the world and to America. And the third is to be a blessing to every human being who comes across our life. I thought I saw Dina on earlier, and she is an excelling, chaplain. So she knows very well what it means to be a blessing to a human being who's in presence of you. So I really started talking about what we've been hit with in America here, and try to give us perspective that we've been, I'm almost tempted to say spoiled compared to the Jews of Europe and the Jews of Israel, let alone the Jews of Europe a couple of generations ago. And I think the best way, you mentioned Metallica earlier. Metallica has a song called Fight Fire with Fire. So the murderous fire that seeks to annihilate should be addressed and confronted with the life-enhancing fire of Torah and Jewish spirituality. So let's have a conversation. Thank you.